I'm very excited today to be facilitating this discussion about the common ground across various quantitative and qualitative culture development approaches. Today with me is Edgar Schein, Professor Emeritus with MIT Sloan School of Management, author of Organizational Culture and Leadership and Humble Inquiry, as well as a number of other books on workplace culture and other subjects, and Robert Cooke, CEO of Human Synergistics International, author of the Organizational Culture Inventory, Leadership Impact, and a number of other assessments. So it's a little bit of a historic discussion today with two experts with qualitative and quantitative backgrounds to a very deep extent. So thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's start out talking a little bit about the definition of culture. Ed, could you start with how you define the subject of culture?
Well, to me, culture is a multi-layered phenomenon. It's of course based on the founders of organizations having their own values embedded in the way the organization works, and that leads to at least three levels of what you observe in the way of the behavior and what are the sort of values and principles that founders and leaders articulate as to how we work. And then you discover that the behavior and those principles don't always mesh, which requires you to realize that there's a deeper level called tacit, taken for granted assumptions, which are probably originally founder values, but when they continue to work, they become taken for granted and become non-negotiable. This is us, this is our identity, and we kind of forget that we operate from that base and forget that that's what really drives our day-to-day behavior. So culture has to be viewed at all three of these levels.
Okay, Rob, what would you have to say about culture and specifically workplace culture?
We define culture as a system of shared beliefs and values that can lead to behavioral norms that more or less guide the way members approach their work and interact with others. In that definition, we are really talking about two types of cultures. We're talking about the current operating cultures of organizations, and operationally, we measure those in terms of behavioral norms and expectations. We're also talking about shared values and beliefs, and what people believe should be expected in order to motivate the performance of people and lead to the attainment of organizational goals. And in practice, those two things, the so-called ideal or preferred culture that I just mentioned, and the true operating culture of the organization are disconnected.
Okay, so let's shift the focus to when a leader knows they have an issue or a problem, where do they start? Ed, why don't you kick this off with how you see culture helping leaders?
I think my experience is that the leader short circuits something that they feel is not right by jumping directly to culture and not being precise in defining what he or she feels is not right. So when someone approaches me with culture questions or culture proposals, I immediately say why and try to push them toward what problem are you trying to solve, and work a lot on getting that very clear in terms of if we solve this problem, what would future behavior look like? Once we've done that, we can say, all right, now let's look at how the existing culture you've got will aid or hinder movement toward this new behavior that you think will solve your business problem. So now we need culture diagnosis, not before we've identified the future, but as part of working with that hypothetical future. So now I would start focus groups, other organizations start surveys. In both cases, the client should be party to whatever next step is done, not the consultant saying, okay, I've got these super tools now, you're going to use them. No, here are some possible tools, and here's how we can proceed.
What would you add to that as far as the initial interaction with organizations and leaders?
I think I mainly reinforce it rather than adding to it. Love to see culture surveys used, but not if they're unnecessary, and certainly not at the very beginning of an initiative or change program. I think there's got to be discussion, as that said, about about the organization itself. What is the mission? What is the purpose? And discussion about why are we looking to change something? Why are we looking to change culture? Is that the right place to look? What problem are we trying to resolve? What initiative are we trying to facilitate? Or maybe what strategy are we trying to implement? So I really do agree that the use of a survey should come a little bit later in the process, rather than at the very beginning.
Well, and how's the consultative approach that Ed talked about? How does that help in any way before an assessment is considered?
I think it's absolutely critical. I think sometimes people are looking at situations like it's a cultural problem, and it may be, but it may not be. They're looking at situations like they can get a fast answer with a survey. Probably not. They may have some favorite survey in mind when they approach an organization, whether it's a consulting organization or an organization that specializes in surveys, and that may not be the most relevant, the most effective survey for them to use. They may not need a survey at all. And what Ed is talking about is actually critical in making sure that, for example, a survey like ours is used when it's needed and is used appropriately. Also, at the back end, that consultant has to sort of come back and guide the organization in the process of making sense of the survey feedback.
So Ed, it's no secret you've been critical of surveys over time, and could you expand on maybe the front end of this discussion on where you see they may fit, or where you feel they should not be used?
Going back to the definition of culture as being the historically learned way of doing things and the way of feeling about things, culture from the observer's, ethnographer's point of view covers all of life. Therefore, the a priori survey doesn't make any sense to me, because you wouldn't know what to ask. A survey requires you to define a set of items, and as I encounter a culture, until I've talked to a lot of people in a lot of groups, I wouldn't have any idea of what a survey might look like that would be relevant to that particular organization in its particular situation. So that's why I think an upfront statement that I have a complete culture survey just doesn't make sense. Culture is too broad. However, I'm very respectful of surveys that have taken what we do know about individual and group behavior and how organizational systems work, and said, okay, we can build surveys from theory, and we even know a lot about what works better and worse in organizations. So if a survey is built on what we think we know is generally true, and we've looked at the problem that this organization has, then I can see a complete reason to say, well, then let's look at some general surveys that will enlarge your perspective on your problem. You'll be exposed to a whole bunch of dimensions that may or may not relate to whether you can improve the situation that you have. Some of those dimensions will indeed be irrelevant, others will be central, but you'll have more to work with. Now, that survey then would have had to be developed on a theory basis rather than just as a catch-can basis. And as I understand it, that's precisely the strength of the surveys that you've developed, is that they're more likely to fit because they're based on earlier theory of organizations.
Thank you. What do you have to add to that discussion about the value and where it fits versus where it doesn't fit?
I think the most important thing is that even when we restrict our survey to just behavioral norms and expectations, we're actually very careful to say that the organizational culture inventory measures some of the behaviors that might be expected within organizations, and which can have either functional or dysfunctional consequences. I don't think we pretend to measure the entire array of behaviors that might come up in organizations, including in certain cases the most important ones. But we have a pretty good conceptual framework with 3 distinct factors, 3 distinct types of cultures and related behaviors, constructive, passive, and aggressive. And I do feel we do a pretty good job at measuring those. What we need, though, and what I like to see consultants do, is to add to the survey before it's administered, and to do so in an informed way on the basis of their discussions, on the basis of the questions they've asked, to see if there are additional behaviors that are particularly relevant to the organization where the survey is being administered, and where we can add them in to the OCI. We have a specific section for doing that. As a result of that kind of survey, part standardized, part customized, the organization really gets great feedback. They get some feedback where it's standardized, they can compare their results to other organizations, plus they get feedback that is specifically tailored to the kinds of behaviors, the kinds of norms that may be critical for solving problems, making larger changes and the like.
Can I add something?
Yeah, absolutely.
The point about the client being involved in the decision to do the survey seems to me crucial for another reason that hasn't been brought out yet. If I'm an employee and I suddenly learn that I'm going to do a survey, I don't know if I'm going to be very serious about it or even do it at all. So if part of a survey is we want as honest an answer as we can, and we want as many people as possible to answer it, then it seems to me the introduction of the survey becomes part of the change process. And the consultant and the client have to jointly own that and figure out how are we going to get our employees involved in taking this thing so that 1, they'll take it seriously, and 2, that they'll all answer. Because small samples or casual throwaway answers are going to hurt. And I see the people who jump into the survey have no way of knowing whether the answers are any good or not. And I presume that if we insert it in a process, then the existing management can say to its employees, we really need you to take this seriously. We really care. We want these results, and promise feedback. So that's another thing. If you don't promise feedback and act on it, If you just say, do this and we'll see what we get, a lot of employees will give you casual, meaningless answers.
So before there's any even discussion about rolling out the assessment, it should be part of a bigger change effort. And
If you want good data.
Yes, and there should be discussion within the organization about some critical factors, as you mentioned, sampling versus population, for example. Other factors have to do with things like confidentiality and, you know, whether or not people are mandated to take the survey, on the one hand, versus on the other hand, strongly encouraged to take the survey and to answer as honestly as possible. You know, the list goes on, and organizations that tend to not respect their employees, so to speak, also have a tendency to jump into surveys and to administer them incorrectly. And administering them incorrectly without assurances of confidentiality, without assurances that the data are going to be used, leads to more problems within the organization, including basically invalid results on the survey itself.
And you talked about...
Well, let me push on that point, because maybe one thing that can come out of a discussion like this is some brand new ideas. What would happen, see, I've always worried about promising confidentiality, because that tells the employees that we got a problem here. That if you feel that if you give me a straight answer, I might punish you, that itself is the problem. So what if we said employee engagement is our task, and we've got some very good surveys, but let's do it this way. We'll start with talking about employee engagement, and we'll create an employee group that will decide how this will be administered and how much confidentiality do we really need, and involve them, use the survey to start the process of engagement. Why go to all this superstructure instead of saying to the employees, here's our problem, we want good answers, so why don't you employees tell us how to administer? Do you do that?
We do. And some of the best administrations of the survey have come about in organizations that have sort of put together an organizational change team, for example,
Right.
where you have a diagonal slice of the organization
Right.
represented
Right.
on the team. We did a utilities company. I'll never forget this. They were talking about the very issue that you were just addressing. And the change team members were coming in special for this meeting. I happened to be at the organization that day. It was great. It was a utility, a public utility. We had linemen walking in, you know, we had operators. It was fascinating, and they discussed things like this. You know, how much confidentiality is needed, how much demographic information we're willing to share on you know, the survey in the background information section. Should we be able to, like, opt out of a question if we feel
Wonderful.
we don't want to answer it, or don't want to say that, yeah, I'm the accountant who's 40 years old in you know, this particular location, et cetera, et cetera. It really was great. It exemplified that kind of thing, and I think most importantly, that works. It works. It leads to involvement. It leads to better data. It sort of sets the stage for the acceptance and the use of the feedback once it's presented.
So it sounds like the common ground so far is there's an agreement on starting with problems, challenges, goals, starting a dialogue, whether it's change team, leadership team, groups, about what's impacting that problem and what needs considered in the change effort, but then laying out the process, not starting with a survey or anything. A survey may be part of the overall process, but the leadership should be part of that decision.
Survey is a tool.
It's a tool.
I
The
think
survey is not an intervention.
I think the problem in our field is that we link diagnosis to science. And so we try to say our surveys are administered in the most scientifically correct way. And in that process, miss the survey as an intervention. And I've always argued that in human systems, the science that we have acquired from the physical sciences doesn't work in the first place. So you're never going to get perfect scientific data in a human system because of the nature of the system. So therefore you should always think as an interventionist, not as a scientist. You should do as much as you can to be logical and consistent and stuff, but you should always be thinking, how can I intervene to help? And therefore, how can I design a survey and administer a survey and use a survey to be helpful? Yes, I want it to be reliable because it's got to be logical and people will want to know. And yes, they want to know that it relates to some other things, but they sort of take that for granted. What they really want to know is, why the hell am I doing this? What is in it for me to answer 140 questions? Unless it's presented to me as a helpful tool to solving some problem that I experience.
So the change team needs to cover that as far as why would we be doing a survey? You talked about how it may be an opportunity to identify additional areas or additional items that might be included in the survey, and then most importantly, what's after the survey? What are the follow-up things that are going to be done to use the information as part of the change effort, correct?
I think that is correct. The survey, there's no survey I know of, cannot replace the consultants, the leaders, and the members of the organization getting into the problem and discussing it and figuring out what's going on. The strict adherence to the statistical results on a survey and on feedback form, saying that, well, these two things are the best and these two things are the worst, only goes so far. And that feedback does not necessarily mean that it's most appropriate for the organization to focus on those two factors that they got the lowest scores on. I mean, it might be a starting point for discussion, but that's only what it should be. It should be to open up the discussion and talk about, what really matters here. What is going to have the greatest impact? What is feasible to change? What will get the acceptance of everyone at various levels? Can't do that purely through numbers.
So do you see that also with qualitative approaches, where you see people want to focus in on always the problem or the negative aspects?
Yeah, including myself. When I got teaching feedback, the only thing that mattered was the few critical remarks the students made. I didn't care about the numbers. They were probably somewhere okay, but that didn't overcome the fact that if someone criticized something, that got to me. So I think that's probably a very human thing, is to want to deal with the negative stuff first, but get past it.
Okay.
and then redefine negative. I think what I see is terrible in some surveys, a recent one particularly in healthcare, is numbers. The rating scale is 1 to 5, and in the feedback on each dimension, the group gets where it is, and I notice on each of these dimensions there's a little green line. The little green line says, above this you're okay, below this you got a problem. And I asked the people who designed the survey, where did the decision where to put that green line come from? And the answer was, well, it's sort of, we've looked at a lot of groups and that seems to be where it falls. Now that to me is scientifically corrupt. To put a green line in there and say to a poor client who doesn't know from nothing that above this he's okay and below he's bad, when you don't have good hard data that in that industry, again, from 100 companies, the ones who score above this do better than the ones, they didn't have that data. They just arbitrarily put in a line. Would you agree that that really is irresponsible to tell people good or bad without some other criteria?
I'm going to agree because that is irresponsible, very questionable, misleading, and it is unfortunate that I've seen surveys like that as well, and I've asked similar questions. We on some of our surveys, and a number of my colleagues on their surveys, do have benchmarks.
Right.
The ones I respect are derived from very good performance data.
Right.
For example, very good data on outcomes of interest. It might be engagement or something like that. And you know, when done well, they really do make sense. When done poorly or arbitrarily, they can actually be more harmful than helpful.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Agreed.
Because like on this one survey, mutual respect is measured in a group. And so I may come out just above where it's said to be okay and think, phew, when in fact being just above the median isn't good enough, not nearly.
Right.
On mutual respect, you ought to be at the very top.
Yes.
And so being relaxed about it could be really damaging.
I agree with that. One of the things we've done to sort of deal with exactly what you've just said is to provide at least two types of benchmarks on certain of our surveys. One is just the historical average,
Right.
whether it be the median or the mean along a scale. But the other is this true benchmark where you're comparing yourself to, for example, effective organizations measured along certain criteria. And you know, invariably, if the survey's working, there's some distance between that historical average and that benchmark, where you want to be in terms of things like mutual respect, things like developing others, things like giving positive feedback, etc. They truly are quite different.
I want to talk a little bit about terminology, because you've talked about the importance of terminology when people talk about culture or a survey measuring culture. Can you talk a little bit about that, Ed, and how you think an adjustment in terminology might help?
Well, I think the first step is to be specific about what you mean by culture at any point. So when people come to me and want to talk about culture, I immediately say, what do you mean? And then we discover that some people really want to talk about workplace culture, employee engagement, attitudes, how people feel, all sorts of human stuff. And other people really want to talk about merging of two companies, where they're talking a very complicated strategic issue. But then in either case, again, I would push for specificity, and I say, well, if we're talking about this merger, what are the kinds of issues you see? And I say, well, will the cultures mesh? Well, then what are you worried about not meshing? and force again. And here maybe there are useful surveys. What in due diligence should a company be looking at if it's trying to compare its culture with the other company? The pay system, the accounting system, the sales system. I mean, you could derive the relevant areas where if there's disagreement, you're going to have trouble. Or it might turn out that both companies should take your survey to see whether the way in which employees view engagement is so totally different that you're going to have a problem of supervisors mismanaging one or the other group. That could be, to me, a very interesting way of using the survey to see whether in a merger situation that level matters. But it wouldn't be the only level. So again, it's a matter of specificity, getting people to really get past the word culture and what they imagine it to be, and say, well, you know, culture covers all these things, so let's talk about what you really are worried about.
I also want to answer the question, but first I want to talk just a little bit about Ed's example. We have had actually quite a few situations where organizations merging together have taken the current version of the OCI to assess the operating culture. In some cases, we do find that the cultures are very different. And sometimes they're very different, but neither of the two companies has a particularly constructive culture. One might be very competitive and oppositional, the other may be very conventional and dependent. And early on, we started advising them to complete the ideal version of the inventory, because it was actually more important for them to identify the type of culture that they thought the new enterprise should have, and you know what should be expected, reinforced, rewarded, what's going to make the combined organization work. Sometimes that really did turn out to be more important than looking at the similarities or differences in the current operating culture. In terms of the question, the way the term culture is used, particularly with respect to organizations, sometimes drives me crazy. And it's gotten to the point where some people are using it to represent everything. I mean, almost everything in the organization is somehow under the general rubric label of culture. I think the same thing is true of some of the culture surveys. We have culture surveys out there that really primarily measure climate. Now, climate's important, and it's related to culture, but it's not culture. We have other surveys that measure engagement or quality of service, as I think you mentioned. Well, they are not culture surveys. Again, they may be important, but they're more like outcomes of culture. So what I'm hoping is that people will use the word culture to refer to something that's already sufficiently complex. Things like values, things like beliefs, things like norms. They're getting into the qualitative approach, the underlying assumptions that explain the espoused values and the like.
The most impact I've had on the nuclear people is this strange paper I wrote about 3 cultures of management: the engineering culture, the operator culture, and the management culture, which is, again, a different slice, and arguing that every organization has these 3 points of view, and when they don't align, and I think workplace culture would be an offshoot of the operator culture. But it's the designers who come in with all their systems and procedures, and the executives who come in with all their costs and money problems that often create the bad workplace culture.
Right.
So I don't know whether you want to get into that or not.
Well, I think though our definition of our operating
Are the
culture
things
is
that
more
we
like
mess
you.
with?
I think
Yeah,
it's more like your
yeah, good.
workplace.
Good.
I think it's more like your workplace culture. I think they're almost synonyms, where not quite distinguishing between the managerial culture and the operational culture. We're sort of looking at workplace culture as it sort of pervades the organization. I think what we're not looking at it is what you've mentioned, the aspects of culture that influence the strategy and the direction of the organization and the marketplace and that kind of thing. I know I did not set out to measure that. I was really looking at what are the norms, what is expected or implicitly required of people on a day-to-day basis as they go about performing their jobs. When you get into the strategic level, I think the operating culture effects is the implementation of strategy. I think you're talking about something maybe different or at a different level when you start analyzing the forces that determine strategic direction and end up leading an organization to do a certain thing.
Well, let's examine this interaction, because one example in medicine is when the profession decides to implement computer systems for doctors. This is an engineering decision
Yes.
and a strategic decision, which has enormous positive and negative impact on workplace culture.
Yes.
Or at the very same time that the organization is trying to improve its relationship to employees, it also has to do a layoff for executive reasons. So it seems to me the potential for misalignment of the engineering decision and the executive decision and the employee culture is what I see a lot of in organizations. They don't see the connection between redesign, financial issues, and what you would call the whole workplace culture.
Got it.
So my executive culture is really just the very top people who make these big decisions, but then have an impact on everybody.
I guess the way I see that inconsistency between the three systems you're looking at is just talking about the executives and managers, for example. They make decisions all the time about technologies to be implemented, new initiatives within the organization, adjustments in strategy, and also about systems, accounting systems, performance appraisal systems, reward systems. And what they do is make those decisions without considering the impact
Right.
on culture.
Right.
So they'll go for a new technology, and it has no relation to their spouse values, maybe even their assumptions about how things really work, the norms they would like to have in place. Or they'll go for a new performance appraisal system, and that system will maybe solve some problems around immediate performance, but run completely counter to their values around cooperation and teamwork and the like. And I think what happens, and then that disconnect really points towards one of the most important mechanisms for sustained and meaningful changes in culture, And that is if you and the consultant can get the decision makers, even the managers and supervisors at lower levels, to think in terms of the implications for culture of these, in some cases, relatively routine decisions they're making on a day-to-day basis, they'll be able to have a more positive and more constructive culture. So I'm catching what you're talking about. Words might be different, though.
Well, I have something very odd to say to you. You come across to me as much more of a humanist than someone who works primarily with surveys would be assumed to be.
Interesting.
See, I think surveys tend to be scientific, bureaucratic instruments. And to hear you talk about perpetually thinking about improvement and constructive is a level of humanism that I don't normally see in survey type people, which I find very encouraging.
Well, thank you. Thank you. As we were talking earlier, I had certain doubts about surveys, and it was partly in reference directly to culture, given my professors and others who did not particularly feel that culture could easily be measured by surveys. Edgar Hall, for example. But also, I worry that surveys can be somewhat insensitive and somewhat impersonal and maybe dehumanizing. We have on our conceptual framework, one of the norms and one of the values is humanistic encouraging. And the value as part of our framework reminds me all the time that we need to think and do business in a way that respects people and is humanistic. And thank you for saying that you see that, because we are quite interested in sort of playing out the business in respect to those values.
What I find missing, which you're saying is less missing in your business, is the money side. The most recent example where I saw this survey being developed is it's all about making money. Very fancy layouts, beautiful, so the customer up front is paying big bucks for a bunch of numbers. And what seems to be missing is any other value except providing a tool that'll make you money. And I think that's some of my negative feelings have come from seeing that over the years. On the other hand, my first exposure to surveys with David Sirota was it's a wonderful tracking tool.
Yes.
Ask the same questions over time, and it's very important data. So I've always valued that, and I presume that's an important element in the clients that you work with, is to see changes.
It really is. It's one of the things that we really love to do. More generally, I once gave a presentation in Australia focusing on why we're interested in surveys, and particular culture surveys, and how we think they can have an impact. And the whole theme of the presentation was that a good survey, a good culture, a good change program can help you achieve your mission and can move you toward realizing the purpose of the organization. And if you do that right, and if your mission is a meaningful one, everything else will be okay. You'll make money.
Right.
You'll have enough resources to sustain and grow the business, and it will work out. It doesn't work, I don't believe, the other way around. I don't think having the goal being to make a profit leads to the attainment of mission.
Right, absolutely
So
right.
always try to remember that with our business. And we do have the luxury of being a wholly owned, somewhat like a family business, with very close relationships throughout the world. And that possibly works to our advantage in proceeding that way. In terms of what Strode and Associates used to do in our surveys in terms of tracking change over time, I think our most successful clients throughout the world have been using that repeated measures technique that Strode and others developed so many years ago. Very quickly, if we have time, Tim, I'd like to mention just 3 of those clients. One is Lion Nathan, originally from Australia, now part of Kirin in Japan. They have been using our surveys for 2 decades. And every year they add their latest cultural profile to this series of profiles going back many, many years. And underneath it, they have for each year just a number of simple measures: return on investment or share value, etc. And over the years, you can see their cultural profile becoming more constructive and less passive and aggressive defensive. And simultaneously, their market share, their profits going up. We've done the same thing with SAS Central, a credit union consortium in Canada. They've been using the culture inventory, I believe, since like 1994. They have done the same exact thing. They profile their results every year and show what the trend looks like. And as they become an extremely constructive organization, they've won these awards. They're not always meaningful, but in this case I think they are. Best employer and best place for a woman to work and the like. Here in the United States, we have part of IBM Manufacturing, a long-term client, trying to implement a lean approach and also higher reliability, higher quality as part of the lean concept. They've been doing the same thing. Their engineers and their consultants have put together their profiles over time in relation to the progress they're making along the lean criteria. So it's something we're heavily into, and I very much like seeing it done.
When should people use the word culture with the word survey? What needs to exist to call it a workplace culture survey or an operating culture survey? I know you've used that terminology. What needs to be there, in your opinion, to even use that terminology? You go ahead.
I have a rule of thumb.
Yeah.
Okay, and probably goes back to some of the anthropological writings and Hall's notion of the iceberg, the culture iceberg. You know, you really can't see it. It's underwater. You know, I figure if the survey just measures something that's perceived, you know, perceptions of things like involvement, perceptions of communication, of conflict resolution processes, or if it measures an attitude or an outcome, such as engagement, role conflict. It's a climate survey. And it basically summarizes people's perceptions, organizational climate. It's a legitimate survey, but it's not a culture survey. The survey instead measures something that people know or believe, something in the realm of cognitions that might over time be based on perceptions and sort of making sense, coming to meaning out of those perceptions. And then I see it being in the realm of organizational culture and legitimately being called a culture survey. Values, norms, beliefs. Can't do what Ed does because I don't know if surveys are capable of easily measuring these very complicated underlying assumptions. But that's where you need the qualitative approach coming in to make sense of what your somewhat limited culture survey is going to be able to measure.
Okay. And where do you think the language could help in clarifying when it's truly a workplace culture survey versus it's not culture?
I'm not sure, because the language only comes up really in writing or when there isn't any interaction. And the minute we're talking, we calibrate it correctly.
Okay.
So I guess I'm thinking of, this has been on my mind the last 4 or 5 minutes. Have I missed books or articles where you articulate what you've just said? Almost the survey as a intervention tool, where you talk about the values and how the survey really has helped 3 companies over a period of time. I'm not conscious of such literature. Is it out there and I've just missed it? Or have people just not bothered to explain what you can do? And then the word culture would be in the context of the article, and people would begin to understand when and how to use it.
Quick answer. We actually, not by coincidence, have what I think are pretty good case studies and videos and other support materials on each of those 3. The one from IBM was actually written by them rather than by us and presented all around like at IEEE engineering conventions and those kinds of things. At the same time, we are seriously talking about doing more to get the word out and share it more, I don't want to use the word aggressively, but more adequately and really in a variety of ways. So yes, writings and videos and the like exist. We have some great conferences where executives present their results, and we do that in various countries, Romania, Australia, we do some here. We got to do more.
Well, you're probably better understood in the marketplace than in academia.
I think that's true. I think that's true. I think our culture survey is one of these hybrids. It's a survey that was basically developed for the marketplace. But because I've been an academic so long and really respect so much that was done, for example, at the Survey Research Center at the University of Michigan and Northwestern, the survey has had to meet those academic standards and be influenced by so many of the things I learned. But really the survey was always designed for the organizational development field out there, for use by consultants, for use by internal OD specialists and the like. We have published articles, of course, and I'm sure you've seen some of them in academic journals on culture and our measures, but our primary orientation has been toward the users.
And that's the part that I think might be missing. I know that you've written articles which show how reliable and valid the survey is on its own terms.
Yes.
What I'm missing is the survey as an instrument of intervention. And I had to deal with that a little bit with career anchors, because I found the concept out of interviews. You know, the people tell you these things, and pretty soon you end up with a typology that you didn't invent that came out of the data. And the questionnaire that I used, which is basically life history questionnaire, became then an intervention tool. Pfeiffer said, hey, this thing, which was an MIT working paper, would be useful to practitioners in career development. So they end up publishing the Career Anchor booklet, and I say very strongly, this is for self-development only. This is not a test. But the pressure to produce a test was such that I ended up with designing a 45-item survey that's at the beginning of the Career Anchor thing. And people are always asking me, is it reliable and valid? And I say, it's not designed to be. It's designed to be a stimulus to thinking. So I can't tell you. It's as reliable as the person makes it. You know, they can lie. It's not a forced choice questionnaire. But it's very, very hard to stick to that line of this is a developmental tool. This is not a scientific measurement tool.
Well, and that's been an area of focus, I know, on why these assessments aren't used for hiring decisions and other things.
Right. We are aiming toward the development audience. Now, we apply the same standards of reliability and validity that are applied to hiring tools. But really, we have normed the surveys,
Right.
designed the surveys so that they are appropriate for development rather than screening and selection and performance appraisal or the like.
I want to connect us back to the change process. So the survey is complete. You have the results. Where does it connect back to some of the qualitative approaches, and how can you see that connection working to go to the deeper levels of culture?
Well, I think that's an organization development consulting role. It probably has to be worked out on a local basis depending on what problem prompted it. My strangest experience in this regard was when Ken Olson asked me to go to the engineering department of DEC and basically, you know, interview them to find out what's going on, do an interview survey. And I said, when would you like to see the results? And he jumped all over me and said, I don't want to see the damn results. Now that was, I thought, a very interesting attitude. The CEO saying, I don't want to see the results. So what did he have in mind? He had in mind that if I generate data, people who need the data are the people who produce the data. So I have a bias toward what Doug McGregor way long ago said, that accountants, when they go down and find something wrong, instead of reporting it up the ladder to the chief of accounting, should immediately tell the group what they found. So I have a very strong bias toward developing a system of the data coming back to the people who produced it as quickly as possible, and saying, and with facilitators saying, what can we do about this? Because what I discovered in this DEC case is at least half of what people complained about they could fix without management intervention at all. They just hadn't realized that they were doing stuff that didn't make sense. And then a few things that had to be fed up, they decided, you know, what to do with it. But the power of giving the people their own data, in my mind, is incredible. And so I would go that route every time.
It's great. It's actually one of the original impetuses for survey feedback at the University of Michigan. People like Francis Licker and David Bowers, they were collecting all these data on organizations for research purposes, and they started thinking, you know what, we should return these data to the people who generated them so that they can use the data to maybe solve some problems, make some improvements, etc. My dissertation was actually on that, where I hypothesized that the more you return data to people at lower levels in the organization so they can work on the data to solve problems and make decisions and send some of it upward, the more useful the data were going to be. And you know, we were actually able to show with an experimental design with a number of schools that when you got the faculty involved directly in interpreting survey data, they did an awfully good job of using the data to solve problems. Many of the problems, as Ed said, were sort of under their control. The solutions were conducive to being implemented by the faculty members themselves. Yes, others had to be referred upward, but at least they could be referred. So yeah, I think it's extraordinarily important to do that.
Have you had any impact on the industry to do it that way? All I hear about is downward cascading. I never hear about anybody doing this.
Yeah, well, that was back in 1973, and I think it's time to get back into schools. I really do. I would love to do that. By coincidence, I was thinking about that just within the last month or so. I think a lot can be done in schools. Human synergistics and where I was at Northwestern, both very, very much involved in applying organizational behavior and development to schools. That was many years ago. I think it's time to renew that effort, and that might be a real good industry, in quotes, for us to look at moving forward.
Yeah, because leaders naturally, they want to get the data and immediately begin making changes, and that sometimes can be the worst thing to do.
Or worse, look at it, say not too bad, and file it.
Right.
So we've got a couple minutes for some additional closing comments. Again, this was about the common ground across qualitative and quantitative approaches. It seems like you both agree on the importance of the qualitative side at the beginning and immediately subsequent to any assessment, and how an assessment is only a tool in the broader change process. You know, what comments do each of you have about this subject of common ground and how we can build on it going forward? Ed?
I'm very encouraged, and in fact blown away by the degree of agreement. I think it's fabulous that we have a way of thinking about surveys, since they're here to stay, in a way that integrates with change programs, surveys as interventions. The word culture, I think, has to be seen as a bit of it may change. When we think of, if I'm going to do a culture survey, I'm going to change the culture, that's a misunderstanding. I need the survey for diagnostic purposes, but what I'm actually going to change is probably a few things where most of the culture either will stay the same or will actually help me make the changes.
Thank you. Rob, any closing comments on common ground?
I'm almost blown away as well by the amount of agreement. I think we've been very careful to define things, and that has helped tremendously. I'm a big believer in triangulation. I really don't see surveys being used on their own. You've got to bring in other methods, particularly qualitative methods that complement the numbers. I think this has been a great conversation and a great start, and I really appreciate it. I think moving forward to have kind of impact on the proper way to go about dealing with culture, defining it, measuring it, and changing it is to pay more attention to how we can combine. the two methods and create the synergies. I can think of many examples where we really need inquiry when our surveys are being used, where, you know, people can specifically come back a year later to assumptions they were making that were not really properly defined when they entered into the change process. And just the method of it, how you would do that, I think requires a lot of thought and a lot of specification, and could be very valuable in combining the methods.
Hopefully this is just the starting point, bringing some more clarity to this field, and we look forward to sharing some growth on this common ground discussion in future content at constructiveculture.com.
Good.
Thank you both.
And thank you, Ed.
Thank you. It's been very, very enlightening and fun.
Fantastic.